Well, John MacArthur has done it again. Someone handed him a microphone, and once again, he used it to say something at the very best misleading, and at worst, dangerous, unkind, and really perhaps even senile. Now, I stay out of stuff like this. I don't want to build my channel or audience chasing every fire that pops up in evangelicalism. That's just not what I'm about. But this was just too close to home, for what I do to just simply ignore it and not make any kind of statement on it. So here's what happened. In a recent panel at Grace Church of the Valley, which appears to be, your typical John MacArthurite church clone, John MacArthur is there with Costi Hinn and a couple of other guys doing this Q&A panel. And in response to a question about a book on children that John MacArthur has coming out, he had this to say.
Psychiatry and psychology is finally admitting the noble lies that they've been telling for the last 100 years. And the major noble lie is there is such a thing as mental illness. There's no such thing as PTSD. There's no such thing as OCD. There's no such thing as ADHD. Those are noble lies. To basically give the excuse to, in the end of the day, to medicate people.
So in today's, special episode, I want to address the damage that this does, these comments from MacArthur, the damage that they do to biblical counseling's credibility. I want to talk about MacArthur's own mental illness and kind of as a side of that, knowing when it's time to stop picking up the mic. And then I'll do a brief rundown on my NHL stance on medication. Welcome to New Heart Life. If this episode is helpful to you, please consider liking and subscribing. I'm Kevin Lehman, and I'm a pastor and a biblical counselor, at least for now, in Wilmington, North Carolina. So before we dive in, let me briefly summarize J-Mac's comments here. I'll post a link to the full video in the show notes if you want to see the entire context. But essentially, he's talking about this book he's been reading called A Profession Without Reason, where he claims that psychiatrists and psychologists are finally coming clean on the lie they've been telling everyone for decades. And that lie is the myth of mental illness. Now, I'm decently well-read in this area, and I've got colleagues who are even more so, and I can assure you this is not the case. A handful, maybe, coming out and saying this, but it's nowhere close to the majority or even half for that matter. So already his claim draws a lot of questions. I don't know where all these psychologists and psychiatrists are that are just all of a sudden admitting that it was all a lie. But then he continues building on this myth of mental illness, and he claims that there is no such thing as PTSD, OCD, or ADHD. Those are the three that he mentioned. Now, I wouldn't be surprised if there wouldn't be others in those lists for him, but those are the three that he mentioned in this clip, which you caught just a minute ago in the clip that I showed. And so he says these fake diseases and illnesses give doctors an excuse to medicate people so that big pharma can cash in on this whole process. And he gives an example of how PTSD is really just grief, and grief is just a part of life. And if you don't learn how to deal with it, you won't be able to live. So you see what he does there. He takes something that we have understood to be a mental phenomenon in the brain, an illness that has occurred. Something is broken in the brain, and he's made it a spiritual issue. He's made it just someone who doesn't understand how to deal with their grief. And that's kind of the summary. But I'm not trying to straw man. So by all means, watch the full clip if you haven't seen it already. Like I said, I'll put it down in the show notes. But here's what I really want to talk about. And I don't know that a whole lot of other people will be talking about this angle. As a result of this coming out, I've seen a lot of hate on the socials regarding biblical counseling, and specifically the ACBC, which is the Association of Certified Biblical Counselors. And of course, John MacArthur is tightly wound to this movement and organization, as primarily through Ernie Baker, the movement has gained traction in both of MacArthur's schools over the last couple of decades, which would be the Master's College and the Master's Seminary. And so full disclosure, I do not have a ACBC certification for reasons that I'm about to explain, but I do have a Master's in Biblical Counseling from Faith Bible Seminary, which is deeply connected to the ACBC organization. I identify, at least for now, as a biblical counselor. I mean, that's what I do. I counsel people with the Bible. I don't know what else to call it, but I'm certainly, especially these days, open to other suggestions if you have any. But let's talk about why I am not a member of the ACBC personally. And that's because I have a strong divergence from them in our understanding of the origin of sin and sinful desire within the believer. And that's kind of what this entire channel focuses on. So for them, every sin is a spiritual issue that is born out of the heart or the soul of man and is some malfunction in worship or even in many cases idolatry. And I talk about this in a lot of my other videos, but let's put it like this for now. If you believe, as most ACBC members would, if you believe that every sin is spiritual in origin, then you don't have a category for anything that could be purely a bodily malfunction or a brain malfunction or a chemical malfunction. So when you're presented with dysfunctions of the brain, you have to reject the physical nature of the malfunctions and make it into a spiritual problem, such as what MacArthur did with PTSD into grief here in this clip. Now, I'm representing a general view here, but opinions on this stuff, even within the ACBC, are quite nuanced. So I would encourage you to be careful about applying blanket labels to everyone who wears the title of ACBC. They're not all the same. But see, when you look at what we've done with New Heart Theology, which is the launching pad for New Heart Life here, we see the dichotomy. We see it. We see this dichotomy between flesh and spirit, or body and soul. So I have a category for mental illness because I do not believe sin or the breakdown of the mind begins in the soul or the heart. God has made it clear that He made that part of us new at salvation. But that means He leaves us with a dysfunctional body, and our brain is part of that body. And so it should be of no surprise that our brains don't operate the way they should all the time, or really even most of the time. I believe ADHD, OCD, and PTSD are all very, very real illnesses, where in many cases the brain is just broken in some way and needs to be addressed, sometimes with medication. I believe you can sin in your ADHD, as I have firsthand proof of in my own life. I believe you can sin in your OCD or your PTSD, but I also believe that any of these illnesses can be harnessed and navigated through the new heart God gives us, again, sometimes with the aid of medications. So the Bible doesn't necessarily say that we'll ever be freed from mental illnesses, but it does say it's sufficient for living a godly life in spite of our mental illnesses. It provides rich wisdom on how to navigate these tough issues that are a result of our fallen bodies. And sometimes wisdom means medication, but it always means recognizing our bodies, brains included, don't always work the way they were intended to. And the irony of all of this is that you can literally see in this video MacArthur's mind not working the way that it used to. He's not as sharp as he once was. He's not as guarded with his words as he once was. He takes longer to formulate thoughts, and he speaks with less clarity than he once did. You can tell in this video that he is struggling to remember certain things that he would have easily remembered 20 years ago. He's just not as focused, and he has a hard time staying on topic. And all of this is due to the aging and breaking down of his brain and the way that affects his mind. And so MacArthur literally has a mental illness. It's called aging. His mind works differently at a slower pace and a less concentrated functional level than it did when he was 40. And so as our generation is starting to see the pastoral giants of our age kind of fading out of the picture, and this is the first generation, by the way, that this has happened in such a public way, let it be a lesson to us to know when it's time to step down. John MacArthur, for the most part, unless he's scripted and staying on script, probably doesn't need a mic in his hand. At this point, in a lot of ways, he's doing more damage than he's helping. But we see these guys have such a hard time letting go. We see it happening in almost the exact same way with John Piper. And I get it. They've spent their entire lives, for the most part, building these enormous and influential ministries. I would imagine it's very hard to let go. I mean, how do you sit in your home with loved ones without the spotlight that has always been on you? How do you give up the money that's rolling in? How do you trust the guy who comes after you? What do you do if someone squanders your life's work? And on top of that, due to hero worship and legacy building that's often glorified in these cultures, most of the people close to them won't speak up and let them know it's time because they would immediately be cut loose and canceled. I mean, realistically, someone might have to pry the mic from these guys' hands. From this clip we're discussing today, I wish, you see Costi Hinn sitting directly to MacArthur's right, left on screen. I wish Costi Hinn had lovingly and kindly reached over and just kind of gently interjected, or taken over as soon as the words, the myth of mental illness, left MacArthur's lips. And so at this point, MacArthur needs a pre-approved script, and he needs someone strong enough to protect him from himself. I have told my own wife and daughters, look, when I start saying crazy things, at least on a regular basis, you gotta keep the mic away from me. Tell me when it's time and remind me that I trusted you to do that. Okay. I know I promised a bit on medication at the end, but it's going to have to be really punctuated to keep the final cut within the time frame for which, I prefer to aim on this channel. And so let me say first, when it comes to medication, I reject any view that says it's always the answer or that it's never the answer. There's a lot of nuance here. I guess I would start by saying that I do believe a lot of people take medication that don't need to, or at least don't need to anymore. And keep in mind here, we're talking about psychotropics, and that's it. I'm talking about medications that are used to directly affect the mind. And I think in their best implementation, they are something that we use temporarily, to kind of get our bearings in a tough situation. That's certainly not to say that there aren't situations where extended or even lifelong treatment is needed, but I do think there are a lot of mental illness circumstances that can eventually be managed, not cured, but managed with the new heart God has given us. We see in Ephesians 3, Paul talks about the power that is at work within us. He actually mentions it twice in that passage. Peter, in the first chapter of his second epistle, talks about us being partakers of the divine nature and it being everything we need for a life of godliness. So for now, and I'll do a full video on this later, probably with a guest who's more of an expert in this though than I am, and more of an expert in kind of this line of thinking than I am. But for now, we should approach psychotropic usage cautiously. There are some serious long-term effects on the brain and lifestyle that are starting to come out for many people who have taken these drugs over an indefinite period of time. But hey, if you're in a tough spot and a medical doctor thinks a cycle of these meds could help you get rebalanced, I'd say more power to you, and don't let anyone shame you for doing it. That's all I've got for today. I'm typically around for questions, so hit me up in the comments if needed. As always, you can support the show with likes and shares and subscribes and positive reviews. Thank you so much for listening, and God bless.